Hey there, welcome everyone to u-nite, a Unity Temple's weekly interspiritual service. I'm Reverend Nhien, and I'm so excited to be synthesizing sort of this 6-week journey that we've taken through this amazing, for me, deeply transformative book known as The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer. So, as with every week, the service that we hold today is an interspiritual service. And what that means for us is that while unity is both historically and culturally grounded in the teachings of Jesus, teachings like unconditional love and grace and forgiveness, as opposed to the teachings about Jesus, we also just actively embrace practices and principles from the world's spiritual and religious traditions, understanding that all of these have something to teach us. And this book in particular, Michael Singer, comes from the yogic tradition. And today's focus will actually kind of blend both Taoism and Buddhism. So that will be the focus of today. Now, tracing back to the first week, I want to remind us of how we started. In the beginning, it was this question, this really important question that we may not ask every morning, which is the question of identity. Like, who are you? And Michael Singer, sort of imparts to us very early on that we may not be what we think, that we are typically associated like with our thoughts. We identify with the thoughts in our heads. But he's like, you are not the voice of your mind. You are the awareness that can hear it. So all this begins first with the question of identity. And then in the second week, Marcus shared with us a beautiful sermon on experiencing energy that goes with part 2 of Michael Singer's book. And in this, we were reminded, not only are we not just the voice of the mind, but what if everything that is, including us, is just this infinite, boundless energy, life force. And if we wake up to that, then we have full access to all that is for our highest life expression. And so that takes part 3. And in part 3, I went over the topic of freeing yourself. And so in that, we recognize that, hey, we may not realize it because we're so used to it, but we contort the everyday actions and choices that we make based on a wound that we hold inside, your inner thorn. And so instead of just living vibrantly and freely, we do what we can to avoid hurting that wound. And so if we want to be spiritually free, if we want to live our divine potential, our highest life, we have to first recognize that, oh, I'm so used to it. You know how you just get used to leaning one way? I remember in college I had this backpack, and I realized I'm carrying the backpack on one side, and my whole body's a little tilted like this, and just not even realizing it because we've been doing it for so long. And then in part 4, we talked about going beyond. And so it's not even just if you go inside me, I have this inner thorn, but my whole being is protected by this house known as my personality. And usually when something happens to attack that, the habituated response before we become conscious is protect it, reinforce my identity. You called me a bad person, you called me a selfish person, you called me a stupid person. Well, I'll show you, right? And so instead of protecting our personality, so not only do we sort of free ourselves of acting out of our inner thorn, but when things hit us and they break down that wall, we let it come tumbling down. We expose ourselves. We let ourselves feel the rawness and vulnerability. And in that, we're able to do what is the title of part 4, which is go beyond. And then through that process, we arrived last week in part 5, and I'm doing part 5 in 2 parts. Part 5, which is called Living Life. And in this section, what came up most for me was the chapter on unconditional happiness. What if it really is a choice? That now, as we begin to heal and free ourselves of our inner thorn, as things hit us where we don't defend, we just live in this vibrancy of life with this free flow of energy, that we can actually in every moment say yes fully. In this moment, yes to life, yes to everything that's happening in, through, and as me here now. What a magnificent, sparkling way to live. And then as we close today, I want to explore how, especially given this very, this Western culture that can emphasize excess, the more the better, the bigger the better. I remember having friends from France visiting, and when they looked at the portion sizes of the dishes that we have at some of our restaurants, they're like, oh my goodness, like the more the better. That instead we borrow from the Eastern in adopting the middle way, a way of balance, a point of equanimity. And so that will be our exploration for today as we close this wonderfully invigorating series on surrender. Sona was this really young disciple of the Buddha. And Sona, like the Buddha himself, came from a very affluent family, was a strong academic, had a strong sense of discipline, knew how to play multiple instruments, and he happened to go to a talk when the Buddha was in town. And when he listened to the Buddha's discourse, this idea of finding happiness through non-attachment, he realized that despite all the wealth and position that he had in his life, he didn't have this happiness. And so he decided in that moment to renounce his wealth, his position, his family in some ways, and to follow the Buddha, to enter into monastic life. And he was even known, back then, the idea that like the wealthy didn't have to labor, so their skin over the generations was particularly soft, known for its softness. Under like his feet, the skin of his feet, he was reputed as having like especially like baby skin in all of his skin. And so he goes, this young man enters the monastery, and when he does it with everything that he learned. Be a good student. Be responsible, be disciplined. And so Sona worked hard. When he learned that mindful walking was an important part of the practice, there he went, mindfully walking back and forth a ton until literally his feet had blisters on them. And he meditated not just the same amount as the other monks, but dutifully. He worked hard in earnest, and he meditated extra. And so this was his stance until one day he felt so miserable by all this hard work that he approached the Buddha, and the Buddha could already sense that he was considering leaving the monastery. And so in that moment, the Buddha remembers that back in the day, Sona used to play the zither, which is a kind of lute, like it looks like a box, a beautiful wooden box with these strings across it. And so the Buddha uses this as an example and asks him, when the strings of your zither are pulled really taut, can you play the instrument well? He's like, no, not at all. It sounds awful. It doesn't sound good at all. And then the Buddha asks, well, when you play the instrument, when the strings are very loose, does the music sound good? He said, no, not at all. You can barely play it when the strings are too loose. And so the Buddha says, well, when the strings of the lute are neither too loose nor too taut, can you play the instrument well? And he says, yes. When it's neither too loose nor too taut, the music flows beautifully from it. And so the Buddha says, just like you, when we, in approaching our lives, are not too taut, too tense, if we don't work too hard, when we do work hard, what happens is we become irritable, we become tired, right? And he's like, on the other hand, like if you're too loose in your life, there's a sense of lassitude, a sense of deep weariness, a sense of laziness in approach. But when you are in balance, then you open up to find the way, to experience the way. And I think about Jesus, even as I said, that I am the way, the life, that there is an opening within us that is available somewhere in the middle of effort and of non-effort. There's this place that's not too tense nor too wishy-washy in our lives, a place of balance. In Taoism itself, the word Tao is most often translated as the way. But even then, in Taoism, the teaching is, yes, but the Tao that can be spoken, the Tao that can be put into words is not the true Tao. It is much more subtle than that. Like the way is something very subtle, and it's something that a word cannot pin down. So when people who are brought up in the Western world like me, come across teachings like this, we can have multiple responses. One of the responses I had when I first learned about Taoism is, well, that doesn't make any sense. Even if I kind of like that idea, how on earth am I going to do that? Like, what does that even mean? Like, you can't tell me what it is. You can't show me the way. But how do I live into the way? And so there is the way in which, for the head, and also the head types represented on the Enneagram, there's this wanting to know the outline, wanting to know the specific steps, wanting to give words to this ineffable kind of experience that these wisdom traditions are pointing at. And we get frustrated when this idea, like, what does it even mean to be in balance? If you're talking about, okay, if you want to use the word balance, what does that even mean? Does that mean that I should only eat this much and not that much? But balance seems to be different for different people. So how do I know if it's too much for me? And my head goes spinning and spinning. And I go to my spiritual teacher to ask, and she won't give me an answer. How do I know what's too much and too little for me? The mind asks. And then the heart, and the heart types on the Enneagram can have this sort of reaction, those of us who feel deeply about life. Wait a minute, this way that you say that is sort of in the middle, this balance. For me, it doesn't feel like I'm alive. I am so used to intensity of emotion that when things are just meh, like I don't feel alive in that. And so how is this good? And so there's this skepticism for those of us who sort of live passionately. We're like, how is this an okay thing? Will I just be complacent? And maybe it feels like that, and the heart doesn't know or understand what that can be, to just be in this like middle way, right? It feels maybe even a little like apathy, just normalcy, nothing pushing me. And the body, in the time of extreme sports, like to have the body say, oh, no, like we don't have to go hard at this, right? We don't have to go to an extreme in this. Or to the other extreme, because what's common also now is like fasting, right? Like how we go to extremes in our body in this sort of effort to feel this energetic aliveness. So in the midst of these different ways of approaching things, we can have in our Western modern way or culture some confusion and even some skepticism around even the value of what that means. I know I personally, I am a passionate person, normally, titled zealous and intense by people around me. And, I know that for me, I have a personal sense of okay, I don't want to be dead though. I want to live full of zest and alive. So what does that mean for me? And so that's the focus that we'll explore for today. How can living the middle way be the absolute most energetic and energized way of being in the world? So I'll begin simply by, when they say, we can't define the way, but we can point at it. Most of us can intuitively, or just common sense, say, hey, yeah, food, it's good to eat. It's good to eat. But it's not good to eat all the time, right? And you can say, yeah, I'm a person, I have a preference. My personality, I like the temperature on the hot side. But that doesn't mean I'm going to want it to be 110 degrees, right? And so, I tend to prefer the cold side. But I lived in Alaska, and one time I went hiking in 15 below zero, and I don't prefer that either, I found out. And of course you go too low, and you have the extreme of death, right, to your physical body. We know that's not healthful for the body to go to extremes like that. There's a balance, and there's a balance that's different for each of us. So the idea behind this is not that we figure it out with our heads, and not even that we figure it out with our hearts, feeling our way into some sort of place in our hearts. It's not that we necessarily figure out this middle way with our bodies, but somehow, by releasing our identification with all three of those, by remembering that we are that awareness behind it, something happens. And that thing that happens can be sort of analogized to, I'd say, I was remembering when I was reading this chapter, how much I absolutely loved seesaws when I was a kid. And there was a park across the street from my elementary school that had this fun seesaw, really simple park. I think back and I was like, how big was that park? And when you're this little, you think it's a mile big. It was probably a quarter of a mile big, right? You could see across the park. It's a little cute park. And there was a seesaw, my favorite thing, and I'd go. But I was always smaller than everyone else, right? But I remember part of the fun was figuring out where to sit on it if someone was heavier than me to balance it out. And the funness wasn't just going sort of up and down or, going across, but there was something exciting about trying to figure out sort of this balance, sort of the fulcrum in the middle, right? And then I think also in my spiritual journey, how I will go intensely into reading spiritual books all the time. And then I realize, I'm reading about life more than living life. And so let me move a little closer to the middle of this. I'm reading about living life, not actually living the life, and not actually being outside. So being aware of all these things. And now let's look at not just behavior, but what happens inside of me. So in a moment, even as I'm reading a book, if the book has a description has a story about something, he often talks in his book about relationships, right? And so that gets triggered for me. And I was even thinking about that, whoa, I can see my emotions get heated one way and the other way. And so one of the things we can do is simply become aware of our behavior. How do I tend to act in the extreme in one way? Either intensely doing until I collapse and then nobody can get me up from the couch kind of thing, watching, having the awareness that is like in the middle of that. And then being aware around, I think on a deeper level, even as we're engaged in our daily behavior, whether we are running about or sitting on the couch, what is going through my heart and mind right now? Whoa. If I start to pay attention, if I'm not so over-identified in my feelings, but if I start to become the awareness that is mindful of that, I can feel how, whoa, suddenly I had this, this email come in and my emotions went this way and I was so upset by this that now I'm feeling the movement of my body wanting to go talk to this person to change this outer circumstance. I start to become aware. And so I become the awareness that watches the pendulum swing. I'm no longer on the pendulum, but I'm the awareness that watches it. I'm the fulcrum in the middle. And then, but what it takes is when that hits, what happens is, commonly what happens is when I feel that, oh, that hurt. Or when I feel that, oh, someone just invited me into a situation where I feel tense. So right now I feel fear, right? I feel fear coming up. Maybe it's a certain speaking thing that I'm a little bit nervous about. And so I feel the way that tension moves through me. And instead of going back to acting from that tension, going, okay, well, that means I have to hustle now and figure all these 10 things out and do an additional research so that I could show up there. Trusting in life so deeply that in this moment now, I was hit, I let it move, and I let it go. I let it go. I let it move through me. I don't just let it bypass, I let it move through me. What happens? In our regular culture, we think if we just let emotions move through us, a lot of us think we don't act. Like, well, we got to go do something. Well, I don't want to act from this uncentered place, right? And so we go back to a classic quote that I often quote from the Tao, which is essentially that, do you have the patience to wait? If you're thinking about a water glass, do you have a patience to wait until the mud settles and the water is clear before right action moves of its own accord, right? Spontaneously from that. No, we move from the mud. We're like, this is dirty and we're gonna go find ways to clean it. But by doing that, we haven't actually purified our consciousness. We're not coming back into center. And so we lose our way, and we lose actually at the point of our power, which is only in the middle, the center of our being. Because we're acting from that personality that got triggered, that is fearful, that if I don't do a good job, maybe my livelihood would be threatened. If I don't do a good job, maybe the approval won't be there and affirm that I'm okay. And if I don't do a good job, maybe like my security ultimately will be threatened. My physical security, because I won't have a job, like all of these things that can arise, but instead, I go back to that center. I go back to that center from the place of peace. And the best, for those of you who are 3s on the Enneagram, who love efficiency, 1s on the Enneagram also are like that, and 8s too, with this like desire for directness. As I was reading this, I realized, if you think about a pendulum, what happens is this. Any of us who have been kind of blown over by like relationship drama, or any kind of drama really, recognize that like you could be doing your everyday stuff, going like this, and then what happens? Something big happens and we're swinging, right? And so right now, the whole time is spent trying to find balance, right? Trying to find balance again. 3 days goes by, and I haven't moved toward what I knew I was called to do. Maybe it's the piece of art that I wanted to work on. Maybe, it's the step in my vocation. Maybe it's the reconciliation with my father. Whatever it is that was just like moving me along to my highest life expression, and boom, this swing happens. And we spend our life force working to either swing it the other way, right? Oh, I don't like this feeling of fear. I'm going to go out into the world, assert myself. And we're going more like this. And I used to go hiking. This is part of my intensity. And even when it was like a guy who was like maybe 6 foot, much taller than me, could probably walk faster, I was obsessed with walking quickly. And burning calories. And so I would zigzag. I would literally like go down the hiking hill just to get more like motion in. And it's hilarious thinking about it now. But if you zigzag through life, that's a very inefficient way to live. But most of us zigzag, right? We get swept up in the current of what I must do now to resolve this egoic issue, instead of letting it go, releasing. And as Michael Singer teaches, as the Tao teaches, we don't have to effort into this place, into the center. We just have to let go of that which has thrown us off center. And most of us habitually are taught, don't let go, fix it instead. Figure this thing out, hold on to your problem, and go figure out how to fix it. So it's counter to the way most of us have been taught. But somehow, by going, oh, I was getting tight, tense, let's fix, instead, let it move through me. Now in peace, how shall I live? What shall I do? How shall I act? So a very immediate, a very proximate thing happened to me that's related to this. So many of you here were actually on my contemplative Enneagram retreat that we had at Unity Village yesterday. And it kind of, as the retreat was approaching, I was like, wait a minute, this is headquarters. Unity Village is this phenomenally beautiful place, and a place that I consider to be like one of my favorite places in the world. It has a sense of mysticism and magic for me. The moment I stepped onto campus as a seminary student, some of you know the story. I literally, I knew I wasn't going back to California. I stepped onto that campus like, I'm staying here. I just knew. So that place has a lot of meaning for me, and I've had many revelations there. So it's a big deal. This was my very first retreat that I was going to lead there. And granted, and also the last thing I'm going to do before my sabbatical starts next Sunday. Big deal. The day before the retreat, Unity Village Chapel, which is co-hosting it with us here, the administrator calls me and says, we have an issue, and says, we double booked the room that you're in. And I could tell you, the old lawyer in me would have been, what the, have that, you're kidding, right? And use my position and just think about how we're sister churches, and how are you treating your sister church? And we had an agreement, and I could have gone through Unity World Headquarters instead of doing you guys a favor and going through Unity Village Chapel, the church that's at the headquarters. I know people at the headquarters. There is so much that could have happened in that moment that thankfully did not happen. It didn't even happen really in my head. But I had enough awareness to see what could have happened in my head. The old ways of reacting that were like, this moment is not okay by me. It's really not okay. It was not according to my plan. And, I went to, I had already told people it was going to be in the community center room. That room is so good for so many reasons, because in that room, it's loungy and casual, and people can just relax. They wanted to move me to Fillmore Chapel, which was formal, and also everything I had planned was around the geographic location within the campus of that, the day before the retreat. and the morning before. And the power of this practice, the fruits of the practice, I could feel move in me. I had a moment where I was like, what's real here? What's real? What's real is I'm going to check this out. I'm going to ask a few questions calmly. I was like, oh, so you double booked. Okay, a family's coming into town. The husband is the one who called and canceled till you thought it wasn't happening, and the wife's pissed. Okay, and so there's this marital thing going on this side for this big family personal party. That's important. They really wanted this space. I'm like, what can I do? You know what? It's really okay. I could see this moving. And any of you who were at the retreat yesterday, I'm sitting in Fillmore Chapel yesterday, and there are glass doors on the side. They're open, like French doors, and we had doors open on both sides, and the birds were chirping. And there's this beautiful moment of realizing the fruits of that surrendering into what is. I'm like, this was so much better than what I had planned, because the community center is totally indoors without windows. Now, granted, there was this prospect of scattered thunderstorms. Well, you saw the weather yesterday. It ended up being 70-something degrees. The weather was perfect. The birds were chirping. And Fillmore Chapel has tremendous meaning for me. It's the first place I've ever given a chapel service. And so there's just this sense of the sacred being in there. I'm like, what do I know about how my life is supposed to go? And the analogy that Michael Singer gives in his book is to sailing, which I'll share with you, but I'll admit I've never been sailing myself. But he says, that when you go sailing, that there's something about when the wind blows a certain way, and it's not that you're not involved. You have some effort in adjusting the sails. You go, so there's some effort involved. But the effort is to go with what's happening in the universe. It's to go with what's happening, not to go against it. And so when you do, you feel the sense of flow. And when I read that, though I hadn't been sailing, I remembered what it was like when I played tennis. And if any of you have played any of those kinds of tennis or any sport like that, I played tennis in high school. Oh, when you're in that flow, running around, and you hit the sweet spot, right, on your racket, it's like nothing in the world. And in that, yesterday, at the retreat, I asked this question about when do you feel most alive, or when do you feel a sense of reality the most? And consistent to the answers was a sense of I wasn't involved. In those moments of flow, the personal disappears. The personal, I'm engaged, setting the sails. I'm the one who has to hold the racket and move it. But in that moment of flow, I'm not thinking about me, right? I've sort of said, this seems to be, being in Fillmore Chapel, being moved out, seems to be the movement of the universe. If I asked a few questions just to check how certain was this, how, could we do this? And it seemed like it would be a strain and an effort to make it happen. So I agreed to change the room. And in my agreement, the alignment. So I can imagine, you might imagine, that if I were upset at her, we might have a very different working relationship. But in the moment of saying yes, and in the moment of feeling like the whole universe, the weather, everything is on our side, then we have a cooperative spirit with that universe, right? And so So I was just like, well, what do you think? Now we're going to be away from the bookstore, which is where people were going to get their coffees. And, she's like, well, I'll get a bunch of bottled waters and have it available next to, oh, great, thanks. And then later, I think, she was just like, thank you so much for just accommodating and being so understanding about it. And I said, the best thing, like the highest expression of life will happen tomorrow for everybody involved, not just my group, everybody. I hold that with you and for you. And next thing I know, she comes back and she says, well, we just got VIP privileges to bring all your folks up to the tower that people don't normally get to go to. And so the water tower at Unity Temple, this is this amazing place in terms of like the view that it offers. But due to sort of some liability issues, there always has to be an employee, etc. This woman went out of her way to get some special like exceptions for our group because of this collaborative spirit of working together. And it ended up being, for me, just like, wow, this is amazing. This is more than I had imagined, right? Right. To be in flow. So let's talk very briefly about this shift from the personal to the universal. That somewhere in the process of when things hit me and I recognize, I feel as if my personality, my personhood is being attacked. But here in Unity, we believe there is only one power and one presence active in the universe. God, the good, in all, through all, and over all. One power expressing in its diversity. Nothing and no one can therefore ever possibly be against me. So the moment I protect personhood against what's out there, I've sort of negated that fundamental truth. But if instead, in this moment, I'm like unprotected, I sense into, I pay attention, where's the momentum of things going? And then I engage with that, I cooperate with that, I co-create with that, And so, but in that, I get lost in a good way. In that, I lose myself like I lose myself when I'm passionate about a class I'm teaching and hours have gone by and I've forgotten myself. I'm not thinking, I'm going to be so good. Will I be good at this? Will I be good enough? The personhood that wants to protect itself, as opposed to that which can let go of that and move into this flow of life and sail with it and feel into it. And so every time, we don't have to figure out what that flow is. We only have to release and relax when we're hit. That's so much easier. But it's only easy when we realize it, right? Because it's sort of, for the most part, I was just like, I didn't know. I was like, I'm hit this way, so I'm going to go down a different street today. I didn't know. I was changing my whole life around being hit or not being hit. Instead of realizing I could get hit and let it move. And so, as we close this series, I want to just again summarize this process that I know, even like for me, even in these 6 weeks, I have to say that I don't know if even 6 weeks ago I would have responded in the same way. Because many of you know, I'm very like these are the rules. This is what you committed to. I have this way of being in, that is the Enneagram type 1. It's very structured. If everyone would just go by the rules, we'd all be fine, right? Like this. And so this fluidity, what do I know about what should have been? And just this openness and spaciousness that this working through this process has helped. And I, again, remind you that if you've missed any of those, all of these are available on YouTube so you can review and work through this as we have been as a community. First step, who are you? Who are you? You don't have to answer that. It's more about letting go of who you thought you were. And for most of us, that's really scary. meaning, oh, but I'm the smart one, or I'm the one that knows things, or I'm the helper, or I'm the problem solver, or I'm the peacemaker, or I'm the strong protector, right? Or I'm the artist. Like all these ways that we require identity be defined. Our God nature, just like God itself, just like the Tao, can't be named or defined. When I live like that, in a way, I'm nothing and I'm everything. So what am I? Infinite energy. Doesn't have to be labeled. It can be fluid. It can move. And then the next thing, well, how do I begin to uncover that? Well, notice the ways in which actually I didn't go to that party because maybe I'm protecting myself from social shame, like the fear that like I don't know how to do that relationship stuff, and so I'm actually very guarded. And I didn't know that. I just came to the point where I think I don't need that stuff, And so it's starting to look at oneself enough to know the ways I'm not allowing life to be lived. I remember when I realized that relationship drama was actually a way I'd be like, I don't have to go forward with my career because this is all happening here and I have to deal with this. It's like, this is a way I wasn't like willing to put myself out there and risk. So I could even see how this strategy was keeping me from a fear I had of failing in this other area. I'll just stay occupied over here. So second step, look at the ways that those outer trappings are sort of pulling you. And then when you get hit, triggered, when I say hit, I mean emotionally triggered, which if you're anything like me, happens all day long, happens all day long in different degrees, right? To be like, oh, okay, well, they said something and that hurt my sense of, being a good person. Usually that's core for one. And so instead of trying to get them to think otherwise, I can instead just feel through that. Relax, release, repeat, right? And then we find ourselves unexpectedly, because we don't control the moments when simply we are free, we are centered, and we are grounded. We control the activities that maximize the moments when we have that, right? And more likely, with this new perspective, when something does hit, it's not in my way, it is the way. Something does hit, let me adjust my sails and flow with it. And in this, we have the path of non-resistance, relax, release, and like flow with this life in this supreme act of faith that maybe, just maybe, life really is good. That maybe, just maybe, we really are one. All of us, everything, everyone in your life, everything that seems to be happening to you. Maybe, just maybe, we can live into that space where we are so awake that we are always energized with this infinite flow of being, that everything that everyone does is part of this teamwork of life. Everything everyone does, from criticism by people to even, abusive words from someone. That doesn't mean we stay in relationship with them. It means that what they offer us is the knowledge of where we are wounded, and maybe the gesture in our groundedness, in our centeredness, is not to fight back, but to walk away. But we don't know that, and I can't give you the prescription. You can only do it by letting go inside yourself. And so I close here and open into a time of meditation by saying that one of the most powerful things for me is the profound understanding that none of us can take this journey of awakening for another person. None of us can do it for another person. I have to do it. You have to do it for yourself. But there's power in community, because in community, we get to deeply know that even though my journey is my own, the need for the journey is universal, that everybody is needing to take this. And so when we can walk side by side together sometimes, there is a joy in holding hands and lifting each other up and encouraging each other through the tough spots, you know, when the oceans are turbulent and we're like, you know, I've been there too. I've had pain, you can do it. You know, to really kind of come into this collaboration with life, with community, with everything and everyone by an individual and a collective letting go.